The giants survived the flood. Since childhood, we were taught that the flood was a divine reset, a total cleansing, a judgment that swept away all corruption. We were told that the earth was completely submerged, that no impure creature survived, that humanity was reduced to Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. But hidden between the lines of Scripture lies a phrase that changes everything. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Genesis 6:4. Those 4 words, and also after that, are the crack in the narrative we've accepted as absolute. If the Nephilim, the hybrid race born of the forbidden union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, existed before the flood, how could they also exist afterward? Wasn't their very existence the reason the flood came? Wasn't the flood sent to eliminate that genetic, spiritual, and moral contamination? The post-flood presence of giants is not a modern theory or a mythological fantasy. It's documented throughout the Bible. They were in Canaan when Moses' spies scouted the land. They lived in cities Israel was commanded to conquer. They stood on the battlefield when David faced Goliath. They were there, not as legends, but as real enemies with names, territories, and lineages. How did they survive? Did they drift on the wreckage of the old world? Were they hidden by the watchers in underground caverns or spiritual dimensions? Or did evil find a subtler vessel to cross the waters, perhaps in a woman's bloodline or the womb of a wife? Whatever the method, the result is undeniable. They survived. And if they survived, then the judgment was not absolute. It was harsh, yes, just, without a doubt. But it wasn't the end of evil. It was only a pause, a warning, a reset that still carried a tainted seed hidden inside. And that seed sprouted, and it flourished. To accept that the giants survived is more than acknowledging a historical anomaly. It's recognizing that the spiritual war that began in Genesis didn't end in Genesis. It's admitting that the forces which once corrupted humanity still operate, still manifest, still influence. We're not talking about ghosts of the past. We're talking about a heritage that continued to walk among us, disguised, infiltrated, waiting. Are you ready to see what comes next? 2. The giants belong to a forbidden bloodline. When we speak of giants, most people imagine men of great stature, formidable warriors, figures bordering on myth. But the biblical and spiritual truth goes far deeper and is far more disturbing. Giants were not mere physical anomalies. They were the result of a cosmic transgression, a direct violation of divine order, an impure mixture between heaven and earth. Genesis 6 presents one of the most enigmatic and unsettling revelations in all of Scripture. The sons of God, translated from the Hebrew Bene Elohim, descended and took human women as wives. From that union came the Nephilim, hybrid beings who belonged neither fully to the heavenly realm nor to the human one. They were not created by God as part of His original design. They were the product of interference, a spiritual rebellion, a genetic and ontological invasion into creation. This forbidden lineage didn't just break divine law, it corrupted the very essence of humanity. The Nephilim were not human, and what is not human, yet walks among humans, inevitably destroys. Ancient texts tell us these beings brought forbidden knowledge, sorcery, astrology, witchcraft, weapon-making, manipulation of poisonous herbs. They taught mankind to kill, to conquer, to dominate. The earth was filled with violence because of them. Under their influence, humanity grew depraved. The blood of the innocent cried out from the ground. And then God said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever," and decreed the judgment of the flood. But this was not just judgment upon mankind. It was judgment upon an intruding race, upon a corrupted bloodline threatening to erase the divine image from humanity. The enemy knew the Savior would come from the seed of the woman. That was the promise in Eden. But if humanity could be genetically, spiritually, and morally corrupted, how could the Redeemer be born? That was the true war, not one of swords, but of seeds, of bloodlines, of inheritance. The giants were more than warriors. They were the enemy's plan to prevent redemption. Their existence was a living insult to God's creation, a monument to rebellion. And if they still walked the earth after the flood, then the corruption remained. Then the war continued. Accepting this means accepting that evil does not always appear visible. It can hide in bloodlines, in family heritage, in entire nations carrying a forbidden history in their veins. It means understanding that not all flesh is equal, that not all descendants were desired by God, that some were born from a union that should never have happened. And that is where everything becomes clear. The wars of Israel, the radical mandates for destruction, the detailed genealogies. They were not whims, they were spiritual surgeries, purging an ancient cancer still threatening to take over the entire body of humanity. The giants were not mere monsters, they were living symbols of a bloodline that defied God from its very origin. 3. The flood was a targeted strike, not a total reset. Most people see the flood as a universal wipeout, a divine reset button that erased all wickedness from the earth. But what if it wasn't total? What if, instead of annihilation, it was a surgical act of containment? What if God wasn't aiming to eliminate all of creation, but to sever something specific, something foreign that had taken root within humanity? The biblical narrative tells us that Noah was perfect in his generations. This phrase, often misunderstood, speaks less of moral perfection and more of genetic integrity. Noah was not corrupted. His bloodline had not been tainted by the hybrid seed. He and his family were the last bastion of unaltered humanity, and it was through them that the story of redemption had to continue. The flood wasn't about rage. It was about preservation, about saving a remnant uncorrupted by a forbidden lineage. God's plan for salvation required a human Messiah, born of a human woman, within a human family tree. If the entire race had been infected, redemption would have become impossible. But here's the unsettling truth. The plan didn't completely succeed. Somewhere, somehow, the contamination survived. Whether by the wives of Noah's sons, by hidden enclaves of hybrids, or by other unseen means, the seed that should have been destroyed endured. That's why giants reappear after the flood. That's why the land of Canaan was filled with their cities. That's why God gave Israel such strict, radical instructions, not because he was cruel, but because a second infiltration had already begun. The flood didn't end the war, it slowed it, it bought time, it ensured the Messiah could still come, but the threat, though drowned, would rise again. Understanding this reshapes everything. It tells us the enemy plays the long game, that spiritual corruption doesn't always disappear with judgment. It adapts, it hides, it waits. And it tells us that what was begun in the days of Noah is not finished yet. Moses wasn't just a lawgiver, he was a chronicler of giants. When we think of Moses, we picture tablets of stone, commandments, deserts, and miracles. But Moses wasn't just a lawgiver, he was a witness to an ancient threat re-emerging. Hidden within the Torah are not only laws and genealogies, but records of a conflict far older than Egypt, the return of the giants. In the book of Numbers, when the Israelite spies return from Canaan, they speak of giants, descendants of Anak, so massive that they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. This was no exaggeration. This wasn't metaphor. It was a reconnaissance report, military and precise, confirmed by the panic it caused among the people. Moses recorded it all. He named the tribes, the Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim. He listed cities they built, territories they controlled. He even described Og, king of Bashan, whose iron bed measured more than 13 feet, so large it was preserved as evidence. Why such detail? Because Moses knew this wasn't myth, it was prophecy unfolding. The giants had returned, and more than that, they were entrenched. They had built societies, they had kings, they had armies. This wasn't a loose remnant, it was a resurgence. Moses understood that entering the promised land wasn't just a matter of conquering territory, it was about purging a corrupted bloodline. Not every enemy was simply a human opponent. Some carried an ancient seed, an echo of the pre-flood rebellion. That's why God gave specific instructions. Some peoples were to be left alone, others were to be completely wiped out. It wasn't racism, it wasn't divine cruelty. It was a war of preservation, a cleansing of a land infested with spiritual contagion. Moses, with eyes that had seen glory and darkness, documented all of it, not for curiosity, but to warn us, to preserve the memory of a battle that didn't end with Canaan, but still wages on today. 5. David didn't just fight a warrior, he faced an ancient seed. The story of David and Goliath is often reduced to a tale of courage, of a shepherd boy defeating a seasoned giant, but the reality is far more profound. That moment in the valley of Elah was not just about bravery or skill. It was the clash of two bloodlines. David wasn't fighting a man. He was confronting a remnant of a corrupted lineage. Goliath was no ordinary soldier. He was a descendant of the Rephaim, offspring of the Nephilim. His massive frame, his impenetrable armor, and his contempt for the living God marked him as more than a physical threat. He was the embodiment of a seed that had tried, since the days before the flood, to corrupt the divine image in humanity. David recognized this. His outrage wasn't just patriotic, it was spiritual. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine who dares to defy the armies of the living God?" he cried. He saw Goliath not just as a threat to Israel, but as a defilement that echoed the rebellion of the Watchers. Armed not with might, but with the authority of divine promise, David slung a stone and shattered the head of a giant, and with it, struck a blow against a lineage that had survived the flood and infiltrated nations. The severed head of Goliath wasn't just a trophy, it was a declaration. The seed of the woman still stood. The line of the Messiah remained unbroken, and this young warrior, whose bloodline traced back to the promise, was chosen to preserve it. Because from the very beginning, this has been the core conflict: the seed of the serpent versus the seed of the woman. Every battle, every command, every war in Israel's history, seen through this lens, becomes a spiritual campaign for the preservation of the redemptive bloodline. David wasn't just brave, he was chosen. And Goliath wasn't just tall, he was tainted. Their clash was the continuation of a war that began in Eden, raged through the flood, echoed in Canaan, and still echoes today. 6. The spiritual war continues in our time. It would be easy to believe that these ancient stories are over, that the Nephilim, the Watchers, and their forbidden offspring are buried in history, washed away by time and divine judgment. But that belief is dangerous, because the spiritual war that began in the days of Enoch, that exploded in Noah's generation, and that resurfaced in the battles of Moses and David, never ended. It merely changed form. It became more subtle, more refined, but not less real. The war continues, and you are in the midst of it. Today, we don't see giants walking among us in bronze armor, wielding spears that weigh dozens of pounds. But their ideologies, their legacy, their spiritual bloodlines still breathe. The genetic corruption may have diminished, but the ideological corruption has adapted. The same principles that drove the Watchers are embedded in systems of power, global agendas, and ideologies masked as progress. But underneath, they carry the same goal: defy the Creator, distort purity, and pervert the image of God in humanity. Look around. Notice how violence is normalized, how perversion is celebrated, how idolatry now wears the faces of fame, wealth, and ego. See how human identity is fractured, how family is redefined, how the sacred is mocked. This isn't evolution, it's strategy, a spiritual operation, continuing the agenda of old: destroy man from within, twist his essence, erase his divine purpose. Do you really believe all of this can be explained by politics, psychology, or culture alone? There is a deeper intelligence behind it all, an ancient force, a spiritual remnant of the fallen lineage. Entities that never accepted defeat, that crossed the flood hidden in wombs, covenants, rituals, and now operate from positions of influence, from disguised temples, from doctrines that lead astray. Scripture never describes evil as an abstract idea. It describes it as an entity, a kingdom, a war. Paul, centuries after Moses, laid it out plainly. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places. Ephesians 6:12. He wasn't using metaphor. He was describing a hierarchy, an organized, intelligent, and persistent enemy. But if there's a kingdom of darkness, then there must be a kingdom of light. You weren't just born to exist, work, and die. You were born to fight, to awaken, to break generational chains, to restore what was corrupted. Because whether others see it or not, you know something deeper is at stake. Every generation must choose its side. And this generation, more than any before, is under siege, bombarded with lies disguised as truth. Why? Because time is short, and the serpent's war on the woman's seed continues. If he cannot stop the king, he will try to destroy the king's children. But there's hope. The same God who raised Enoch, preserved Noah, empowered Moses, and anointed David is still alive, still calling, still arming warriors. You don't need to be perfect, just awake. Awake from religious apathy, awake from distraction. Understand, this war is not a theory, it's your reality, and you're already in it. 7. The Watchers didn't just fall, they taught humanity forbidden things. When we think of fallen angels, we often imagine a rebellion, a war in heaven, and their subsequent exile. But there's a more disturbing truth hidden in the ancient texts. They didn't just fall, they descended with purpose. They came to corrupt, to twist, to teach what was never meant to be known. The Book of Enoch reveals that these watchers, divine beings assigned to observe, broke their post. They desired human women, took them as wives, and birthed giants. But their sin wasn't just lust, it was instruction. They taught humanity forbidden knowledge: sorcery, astrology, weapon-making, seduction, root-cutting, enchantments. They gave tools of power without the wisdom to wield them. They handed over the blueprint of destruction wrapped as enlightenment, and humanity unready devoured it all. Civilization advanced rapidly, but not in purity, in corruption. War became more efficient. Lust became ritual. Knowledge became a curse. The Watchers had opened a portal that changed everything. Their children, giants, devoured the land. But the teachings? They survived the flood, passed down in whispers, embedded in mystery schools, hidden in symbols, preserved in forbidden texts. These were not just ideas, they were spiritual technologies, sacred mechanics perverted for domination. The ancient world worshipped gods that demanded blood, sacrifice, and submission. These weren't myths, they were echoes of a real infestation, and the knowledge they brought didn't vanish, it evolved. Today, the same principles return with new names: enlightenment, self-divinity, spiritual awakening, yet all disconnected from the Creator. Occult sciences flourish, veiled in wellness and progress. Rituals are reborn as trends. Idols no longer stand in temples, but in the digital sanctuaries of our time. The Watchers' influence remains, repackaged, rebranded, but intact. We were never meant to carry certain knowledge, not because God feared our power, but because He knew it would destroy us without Him. This is why God judged them with such severity. Bound in chains, sealed until the day of final reckoning. Because what they unleashed wasn't temporary, it infected the course of history. And unless we discern it, we risk celebrating what once nearly led to humanity's annihilation. 8. The flood wasn't just about humanity, it was a reset of creation. We often see the flood in Noah's time as a divine response to human sin, violence, corruption, and widespread depravity. But the reality is deeper. The flood wasn't merely a punishment for humanity, it was a cleansing of creation itself. Because what had taken root on the earth wasn't just wickedness, it was contamination, a distortion that reached into the very fabric of life. The children of the Watchers, the Nephilim, had corrupted the genetic order. Giants roamed the earth, devouring everything in sight. But worse, the bloodlines were infected. The sacred balance of creation, set in motion by divine design, had been altered. Beasts, men, even the land groaned under the weight of an unnatural presence. God didn't just regret making man. He saw that all flesh had corrupted its way. This wasn't simply moral failure, it was ontological breakdown. Something had entered the world that could not be fixed, only erased. So the flood came, not as vengeance but as reset, a divine reboot to preserve the integrity of what was once good. Noah wasn't just righteous, He was untainted. Perfect in his generations didn't mean sinless. It meant his lineage had not been compromised. He and his family were the last carriers of the original code. The Ark, then, wasn't just a rescue boat. It was a vessel of preservation, a genetic safeguard. The animals brought aboard weren't chosen at random. They were representatives of unaltered kinds. The flood was God's firewall, washing away the corrupted data before it spread beyond recovery. But even after the waters receded, the war wasn't over. The spirits of the Nephilim, disembodied and restless, remained. What had been erased in flesh continued in spirit. That's why evil resurged. That's why giants reappeared. The contamination had been scattered, not destroyed. And so the flood becomes more than a story of judgment. It becomes a revelation of how fiercely God guards his design, a testimony that corruption will never be tolerated indefinitely, that there are limits even in divine patience. And when those limits are crossed, love demands purification. Because creation matters, order matters, and when what was holy is defiled, the waters will rise again. The giants were not just warriors, they were a manifestation of cosmic rebellion. To reduce the Nephilim to myth or mere physical anomalies is to ignore the gravity of their origin. These were not just towering men with superhuman strength. They were the fruit of a cosmic violation, the physical embodiment of a rebellion that defied heaven itself. Their existence was proof that the spiritual realm had breached the natural order. They were not simply warriors of renown. They were warnings in flesh. Abominations born of angels who left their appointed place, crossed forbidden thresholds, and mingled their essence with mortal women. This was not an experiment. It was a declaration of war against the Creator, against the image of God imprinted on humanity. The Nephilim were designed to dominate, to pollute, to spread. They carried the knowledge of the Watchers. Warcraft, sorcery, seduction, pharmacology, celestial manipulation. Wherever they went, civilization advanced, but at a terrible cost. Violence escalated, worship perverted, innocence vanished. And what was their aim? Not just power, but prevention. To stop the birth of the promised seed. To corrupt the genetic line so thoroughly that the Messiah could never come. Every corrupted bloodline was a strategic strike. Every giant born was an act of defiance. They were spiritual weapons disguised as kings and champions. Even after the flood, the mission persisted. These giants re-emerged in fortified cities, in royal bloodlines, in warrior clans. Their presence was always a signal of something deeper, a territorial claim by the enemy, a foothold of the fallen realm. That is why God commanded Israel to wipe out certain nations entirely, not because of ethnic hatred, but because of ontological emergency. These weren't ordinary people. They carried something alien, a memory encoded in their blood, a hostility against God written in their very bones. To kill a giant wasn't just to win a battle. It was to cut off an ancient root of rebellion, to resist a force that had tried to rewrite creation itself. And every time a giant fell, it was a foreshadowing of the ultimate fall of that kingdom of darkness. So when David faced Goliath, it wasn't just a boy against a soldier. It was the blood of the promise challenging the remnant of corruption. When Joshua tore down Jericho, it wasn't just a military conquest. It was a cleansing. And when God preserved a remnant, it wasn't just survival. It was strategy. The giants weren't just taller, they were tainted. An understanding that reframes the entire spiritual conflict of the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, as a war between two seeds, two lineages, two destinies. And the battle is not over yet. 10. The war didn't end, it went underground. Many believe the battle between good and evil was won long ago, that with the flood the giants were gone, and with the cross the darkness was defeated. But the truth is more unsettling. The war never ended. It simply changed form. It went underground. It slipped beneath the surface of history, adapting, mutating, embedding itself in systems, ideologies, and bloodlines. The ancient corruption didn't vanish. It rebranded. The forbidden knowledge of the Watchers resurfaced in secret societies, hidden rituals, and dark philosophies. The giants returned, not always in stature, but in spirit, in influence, in power, in the shaping of cultures. They became kings, conquerors, scientists, priests. They no longer sought to devour the flesh, but to consume the soul. And though the Nephilim bodies perished, their essence found hosts. They whispered through generations, guiding hands that built empires not for God, but against him. Towers rose again, modern Babels, where men reach for godhood, fueled not by faith, but by defiance. Even now, the same war wages. It's no longer fought with swords and slings, but with language, law, art, and technology. The enemy's strategy remains the same: distort the image of God in man, corrupt the seed, and prevent the full restoration of creation. But here's the hope. The outcome has already been secured. The cross didn't just interrupt the pattern, it reversed the curse. The resurrection of Christ didn't just signal victory, it inaugurated a kingdom that can never be shaken. Yet until the King returns, we are still on the battlefield, still called to discern the spirits, resist the lies, and guard the seed. Because even now, the enemy is planting counterfeits, false lights, synthetic wisdom, hollow truths. And those who don't remember the past risk becoming vessels of its return. This is not mythology, it's memory, a history written in both heaven and blood. And it demands vigilance, courage, and unwavering allegiance to the one who conquered death not with destruction, but with love. Because while the war has gone underground, it has not gone away, and the final battle is yet to come.